In our last video, we closed with this challenge. Join us for part 3 as we examine Hitler's theology of hate, how false religion justified genocide. Today we begin that journey, but with a sobering reminder that history's darkest lies are not staying in the past. On March 15, 2025, the Times of Israel reported something deeply troubling. On one of the most popular podcasts in the world, host Joe Rogan welcomed a Holocaust revisionist into his studio, just days after featuring another guest who freely spread anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Rogan's new guest, Daryl Cooper, isn't a historian, though he often plays one online. Yet his appearance followed an earlier interview with a conspiracy theorist who claimed that Jeffrey Epstein was clearly a Jewish organization working on behalf of Israel, and that Israel itself was founded by criminal Jewish cartels. These are not fringe comments whispered in dark corners. They were presented to millions of listeners as if they belonged in the marketplace of legitimate ideas. And this isn't isolated. Cooper has already been given a broader audience by Tucker Carlson, who praised his work as recently as last September.
If there's one message I would like, if there's anybody at the White House or anywhere close to those people watching right now that they need to understand, is the reason this is important to the base is not because they think there's this Jewish pedophile who worked for the Israeli Mossad and they want him held. It has nothing to do with that. It's a proxy for, can we hold these people accountable?
In that interview, Cooper pushed the false claim that the murder of millions of Jews was an unintended consequence of Hitler's war plans, as if the Holocaust were an accident, as if the Jews ended up dead there. This kind of rhetoric matters because it echoes the very theological distortions Hitler himself used to justify genocide. He claimed he was acting in line with the precedent of religious authorities before him, especially those who used twisted doctrine to demonize, persecute, and eliminate dissenters. That is the bridge from yesterday's lies to today's platforms, and it is why this next part of our series is so crucial. Next, let's pivot to why the large-scale rewriting of history by high-profile influencers is a serious concern, and how it could impact our relationship with a crucial ally in the Middle East. Daryl Cooper's positions blur lines between historical revisionism and anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. By minimizing Nazi intent or attributing Jewish influence over German society, his work feeds into traditional anti-Semitic tropes, for example, Jewish manipulation of media, financial power, etc. From a Christian worldview vantage point, this is significant. History becomes weaponized, and foundational moral truths, the dignity of all people, recognition of evil as evil, and responsibility for genocide, are undermined, which opens the way for ideological compromise. His prominence and platform mean that these ideas are not just niche. They potentially reach large audiences and help normalize anti-Semitic framing in mainstream adjacent media. According to writings by the Libertarian Christian Institute, Cooper presents himself as exploring questions and says his purpose is to provoke thought and examine complexity. For instance, in one podcast, he framed his work as digging into what were our priorities as Christians: truth or being tough guys? Some listeners believe his early historical series had value for understanding the Middle East. The allegations tend to focus more on his later framing and public commentary. Nevertheless, multiple credible watchdogs and historians have flagged his claims as false, distortion-based, and anti-Semitic in nature. In an appearance on Joe Rogan's podcast, Cooper claimed, "Millions of people ended up dead, but that wasn't their intent." A month or two after Barbarossa was launched, Nazi leaders supposedly said, "We don't have the food to feed these people." And one of them actually says, "Rather than wait for them all to slowly starve this winter." Cooper argued that the mass deaths of Jews in the Nazi camps were not the result of a deliberate extermination program, but rather of logistical failures and starvation. Why this matters? This framing significantly diverges from the well-documented historical consensus that the Nazi regime had a policy of systematic genocide. Cooper's argument minimizes intent and shifts blame from Nazi leadership to wartime chaos. Also in that interview, Cooper asserted Hitler opposed the mass 1938 Kristallnacht pogrom. He came to be anti-Semitic from feeling the reason Germans were in a sorry state was because they're being manipulated by the Jews, by the Jewish press, by the Jews who own the theaters and put out the films and whatever else. Context. Cooper attributes Nazi anti-Semitism to perceived Jewish manipulation and economic cultural grievances rather than ideological racial doctrine. Why this matters. He invokes a classic anti-Semitic trope, Jews controlling media/film/theaters, which is historically false and part of bigger anti-Semitic mythologies. In a written critique of his appearance, academic Timothy Correas notes that Cooper described Winston Churchill as the chief villain of the Second World War, with Cooper claiming that Churchill wanted a war and kept this war going when he had no way to go back and fight it. Context. While this quote is not purely about Jews or anti-Semitism, it shows Cooper's revisionist historical stance, and thus implicitly diluting the singular culpability of Nazi Germany. Why this matters. Historical revisionism often serves as a vehicle or stepping stone for anti-Semitic denial or distortion, by shifting blame away from Nazi leadership and redefining the victim/culprits model. As we wrap up Part 3, it's clear that the historical record surrounding Hitler, the Catholic Church, and centuries of Christian anti-Semitism is far more complex and far more sobering than most people realize. We've traced the roots of the rhetoric Hitler drew from, the selective ways he appealed to church history, and the dangers of oversimplifying claims that demand careful documentation. But the story doesn't end here. In Part 4, we're going to take this further by examining a major development. A PBS video on the newly opened Vatican archives and what they reveal about Pope Pius XII's relationship with Adolf Hitler during World War II. Historian David Kurtzer, author of The Pope at War, offers groundbreaking insight into what the Vatican knew, how it responded, and what remained hidden for decades. This conversation sheds new light on one of the most contested chapters of modern church history, and it brings important clarity to the very questions we've been exploring. So join us here at the Gospel Vault in Part 4 as we look at these revelations and ask what they mean for our understanding of faith, history, and responsibility in an age of deception. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to share, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. For Evangelist Dave Jacobs and the Gospel Vault, God bless my friends.
He looked beyond the cross and saw